welcome to another lecture evening. This one, a special bill, doubly put on by the Hellenic Society and the Roman Society. The Hellenic president apologises for not being present, so I'm sort of honorary Hellenic president as well this evening. We have a triple decker here. We're going to have 3 talks, each of about 30 minutes, and then there'll be some time for questions and indeed some interaction, tactile interaction, but we'll come to that later. And we're going to start off at the Greek end of the spectrum with a talk by Dr. Esther Eidinow, who after a spell of writing risk assessments in what we know as the real world, returned to ancient history and is currently a lecturer at Nottingham University in ancient Greek history. Her DPhil was on ancient Greek curse tablets and was published by OUP as Oracles, Curses and Risk amongst the ancient Greeks. And were I dare to predict that that is something to do with her title, she'll probably change the title. So anyway, without more ado, Esther.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be here. Thank you all for coming. I am going to talk about Greek inscribed curses, largely dating from the 6th to the 1st centuries BC. Can you all hear me? I think I'm mic'd. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay, good. But first of all, I want to show you this. This is a fine modern piece of graffiti. Provenance, the Islington Canal, North London. Date, 21st century. I can probably do it closer than that. It's roughly Christmas of last year. And I can give you a fine transcription of it, because it is quite difficult to read. So why am I showing you this, you may wonder? Well, I think this is a fine introduction to some of the material that we're going to be looking at for the next 30 minutes. This gives us a vivid, if partial, glimpse of a set of relationships that you could say is fairly typical of relationships in the 21st century. You might disagree with that. I think that what it gives us is a very powerful sense of the emotions of the people involved. And for that reason, I think it shares some very close characteristics, as I say, with some of the material that we're going to look at, which allow us to gain some pretty wonderful insights into the day-to-day realities of the emotions of ancient Greek men and women and the social tensions that they experienced. So I'm going to be talking to you roughly 2 parts in this 30 minutes. First of all, a little bit about what Greek inscribed curses are, how we identify them, what they comprise, how they were written, those kinds of things. And then we'll look a little bit at some of the ways in which we might interpret that material and how we draw out some of its significance for our understanding of Greek culture. But first of all, let's look a little bit at this word curse, because it can be quite confusing. When we first think about the word curse, what we tend to think of are conditional curses. So these are curses that, as you can see with this example, set out a punishment for someone who is going to break the condition that's set out. So I am the lekithos, whoever steals me shall become blind. This is a private curse, and you find it written on private objects, protecting them, keeping them safe from any potential crime. But we also find them in public settings. This is a quote from the famous Theos curses, and these are intended, again, to create a protection. They are a preemptive step. So in order to feel the full ire of the punishment that they promise, you're going to have to do some of the things that it lays out that you should not do. And these curses, so we find them on private objects, we find them on gravestones, protecting gravestones in a later period, and we also find them announced in public, so they are protecting a community. So you find them here, for example, you find them pronounced at the beginning of important meetings, important political meetings in Athens. You find them as people go into the law courts. They set out a series of conditions that make it clear what they shouldn't break. So what people shouldn't do, and there are some of the inscriptions from gravestones that say that things like whoever will attack this gravestone or harm the person within it, they won't have children, they won't enjoy the fruits of the earth, they won't be buried themselves, those kinds of sentiments. So this kind of curse, this is how we usually understand it, widespread, popular, in the public eye, out on display, for a very specific reason. With the intention of preventing anything from happening. The curses that I want to talk to you about are a little bit different from that. And here is an example of one, and an example of an inscribed curse, although I don't think it's the same text and object. You can see with this kind of curse, which is also known as a binding spell, that the punishment, that is the harm that is aimed at the target, is aimed with no condition whatsoever. This is an unmediated, aggressive, occult attack. So this is a very different kind of curse from the kind that we were looking at before. Now, these kinds of curses probably started in an oral mode, so they were probably, we have some indication that they were just sung in some settings, but we have evidence of them from the ones that were written down, which begins to happen in Sicily around the 6th century BC, 5th century BC, and later on in Athens. So they're written onto sheets of lead, and I have this very lovely cartoon from John Hopkins, which shows the making of a curse tablet. So first of all, you take your sheet of lead, it's a nice, soft, malleable material, you write down your curse upon it, your binding spell upon it, you roll that curse tablet up, you probably nail it shut, and then you bury it. And we find these things buried often close to water, usually underground, sometimes in graves, although not as often as you might think, often near the relevant site. So I think Margaret's going to talk about racing curses. Some of those are found actually within the circus, so underneath the starting gate, so that they can have maximum effect on their targets, presumably. So this is how you make a curse tablet. And we find them all over the Greco-Roman world. So there are hundreds of these curses, and they span a long time period. So as I said before, they start in Sicily, is the earliest ones that we've found, late 6th, early 5th century BC. Then they seem to move to Athens around the 5th century. We can trace the beginning of an oral practice, and then they seem to spread out from Athens. So it's almost like Athens as the cultural hub may be the place that takes them out beyond to other places. But we also find a practice in Roman areas that doesn't seem to be connected. So it may be that this is just a natural expression of hostile feeling, who knows. Anyway, they seem to go on until about the 8th century CE. And they're not just lead tablets, straightforwardly. We also find sometimes that lead is shaped. So you find these doll and coffin sets, which seem to mirror the intent of the curses themselves, the texts that are actually written upon them. So you have a figure, hands bound behind the back. The curse is actually written on the lid of the coffin and in part down the leg of the figure. And we'll come back to this one so you can actually see the text itself at some point. So as I say, you get a binding here, which is also reflected in the formulae that we find in the curse tablets, in the curse texts themselves. And the idea behind this seems to be to seek a kind of immobility of the target, that you're trying in some way to restrain them, to hold them down. And it used to be thought, I don't think people largely share this opinion anymore, that the actual nailing of the tablet itself may also have been reflected in this language. And we find in some curse tablets, so there's one that actually has a formula that includes the nailing down that seems to go through some of the steps of the ritual. And we can see from this that the formula, the intent, the ritual, all of these things reflect each other. And what that seems to reflect is a desire somehow to control your target, to restrain them, to make them immobile. Now, there are a variety of ways of putting this across in these tablets. There's quite a lot of fluidity around the way in which that basic idea is communicated. So there are 4 basic spell types. And the first is the list. And this is simply a list of names. And what we think is behind this is that much of the rest of the ritual, much of the rest of the curse itself is actually intoned. And what they're then doing is writing down the important parts. And the important parts are the people that you want to attack. So it's very important to identify them and to make sure that the curse hits the correct individuals. Now, other people think you need to go to a bit more trouble. This is a curse, an all-purpose curse. He's hitting a lot of people at the same time, and it's extremely formulaic. So I bind is going on here in the background, and he's spelling out each time hands, feet, tongue, workshop, everything in the workshop, repetitively, over and over again. Great range of people that he's clearly not feeling desperately friendly towards. And what you see here is the targeting of parts of the body, which again makes us think that this is about creating real physical immobility in your target. But you'll also see that it targets the workshop and everything in the workshop each time. So what you also get is an attempt to bind not only the parts of the body of an individual, but abstract qualities about them, inanimate objects related to them, anything that might in some way give them an advantage, that can be a target for binding. But it doesn't mean that it has to be always formulaic. There is room here for some extremely individual expression. So this is one of my favorite ever curses. It targets a woman, perhaps a woman like this. This is a woman from a hetaira, a high-paid courtesan from a Greek vase. And what we see here is a long, slow description of the different elements that the target presents to the writer of the curse that he wants to restrain, that he wants to find immobile. And I love it because it's a bit like a camera zooming in, right? First of all, you see her from far away, her food, her drink, her sleep. You get a bit closer, her laughter, her intercourse, her playing of the kithara, her entrance, her pleasure. Then we get a bit closer, it starts to get a little bit more physical, a bit more sexual, until you zoom in, finally on her eyes. Finally, you're face to face with her. It's the most wonderful curse. And it also raises for us, of course, this question of which parts of the body are cursed for what reasons. Yes, these are the things that he wants to restrain, but why? Because these are the things that he finds powerful about his target. Okay, so that curse also raises for us some questions about language, about the language of binding, and about the gods that are invoked. So we can see that across the different curse tablets, there are various different ways in which you might attempt to restrain your victim. So you might bind them up. immobilize them, but you might also consign them or register them with particular gods. You might dedicate them to those gods. So you're handing these individuals over for the god to then get the kind of punishment, give the kind of punishment that you want them to. And again, there's always still some room for individuality. I utterly bury Numenios and Demarcus. It goes on and on like that curse. I utterly bury, repeatedly. It gives you a sense of the strength of feeling of the writer. And these are, of course, some of the gods that we would in fact expect to find on these curved tablets. These are gods related to the underworld. Hermes in particular is a big focus on these cursed tablets, but we also find obviously the witch goddess Hecate, Demeter and Persephone, Gaia, Pluto. These are all, of course, gods that are associated with the underworld, and that's who we would expect to find, I think, on these tablets. But what this reminds us of, and this takes us to a third type of formula, is that for us this looks like magic, whereas for the Greeks that definition is much hazier. This is a period in which ideas about magic are coming into shape. So what we can think of this as instead is it's one more ritual practice. It's one more way of addressing the gods that attempts to get those divinities to do some of the things that you would like them to do. Okay. And then this takes us to a fourth spell type, which is the spell type of analogy. So this is where you find formulae that attempt to deal with the target by getting them to resemble something immobile, cold, passionless. So if you want that, you compare them to the lead of the tablet on which it's written. Or you might ask that the victim resemble the lettering on the cursed tablet. And in those cases, we often find that names are written backwards or somehow twisted round. So that, again, we find that the ritual itself obviously mirrors the way in which you want this spell to affect your victim. And you may also find on some tablets indications of more elaborate rituals. I don't know what had happened to this puppy, but I think we can guess that it's unable to rise, and that's what you want to happen to your target in turn. And again, returning to this cursed tablet, this doll and coffin set, we see that the desire to create some kind of analogy runs as far as actually creating an image of what you want to happen to your target. And there are some people who argue that cursed tablets were only meant to immobilize their victims. I think that that's actually quite hard to agree with once you see that it's actually written on a little doll and coffin set. The intention behind such a modelling seems a little bit more extreme than that. And again, you'll see that on some of these doll and coffin sets, you've got twisted parts of the body. So again, it's not just that you want to bind them, you actually want somehow to do them a physical, some kind of physical damage. And another way of creating an analogy is to actually talk to the corpse with which the cursed tablet appears to have been buried. Now, as I said before, in a number of cases, these curses are not found in graves, and not as often as you might think. But there are certainly cursed tablet texts that appear to be talking to a corpse. And this is one of the famous ones. The name of the corpse appears to be one Passionax. And the analogy is that the corpse can't recognize the letters because it's inert and dead, and this is what you want your victim to be like. You want them to be as inert as the corpse with which they're buried. Now, this may seem surprising to those of you if you know about later types of Greek magic where the dead are actually asked to perform magic. And that's the period, if you like, of the restless dead, where those who are dead by violence, those who are unburied or not properly buried or have not gone through certain rituals in their lives, like becoming married because they've died too young and it's untimely, their death, they're presumed to be restless and so therefore capable of carrying out a magical spell. But in fact, this kind of activity doesn't really happen, and what we tend to have in the earlier period of cursed tablet writing is the inert dead, to tell you the truth. Later on, you'll get such exciting things as corpse demons who are sent off, Eidinow, sent off to create havoc frequently. But in this period, the most they're going to do in general is witness the curse text. So the youth who died unmarried, the curse is written before them, and they are taken as witnesses to try and reinforce the power of the curse. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the first part. So I've got a very little bit of time to do the second part. We've looked at dolls and coffin sets and lead inscriptions. We've looked at the different types of formulae. So now a little bit more of a focus on who's writing these texts, when they're writing them, what circumstances, and what exactly it is that they want, why it is that they're writing these texts. And the difficulty with answering those questions is that it is very, very hard to find anything that's really clearly written about this practice in the period that I'm looking at. So I've put this up because these are all the different kinds of names. These are the different names given to these curse texts during a slightly later than with De Fictio, the period that I've been working with. And you find all these different terms, and we're not always sure that the curse tablets is what they refer to. Pharmaca can mean drug or poison, but often people interpret it as meaning a binding spell. But they're referred to in many different ways, and we don't even know what the Greeks themselves thought this practice was about. Moreover, in terms of looking for things we don't know, although we have plenty of names of victims, we actually don't know who's writing them. So we very, very rarely get the curse that includes the name of the person who's actually put it down on the lead. So we're living in a world of victims. We're not living in the world of the writers of these curses. What can we pull together? Well, we know that there were professionals who went from door to door, according to Plato, and sold things that may include these kinds of technologies. So if a man wishes to harm an enemy, at slight cost, he will be enabled to injure just and unjust alike. So we think we know that there are professionals who are writing these, and this is reinforced by finding occasionally caches of tablets that all appear to have been written by one person, as if he's quickly getting them all written out so that he can then sell them to specific individuals and personalize them perhaps. So we know there are professionals writing them. We also know, because I've shown you one individual expression, that it looks as if some individuals take what's generally known as formulae for these kinds of spells and adapt them for themselves. This is a particularly beautiful one from Pella in Macedonia. And you can see it starts off with a binding of a spell. It's actually written by a woman. And we know this because she names herself down here. As she begins to start, it's almost like a hysterical. She starts to become hysterical on the text itself. Please, for my sake, please don't let this happen. Please, please. It's hard to imagine this being written by a professional at dictation. We know there are people writing them. We know, moreover, that there are women writing them. And that, I'm sure you will know, is a very rare kind of evidence to have. So from the terminology and the language of these curses, we can identify that there are more or less 5 kinds of curse. So 5 circumstances in which curses were likely to be written, binding spells were likely to be written. And these are in the law courts, because we can tell from legal terminology. These are what have been called commercial tablets, which are spells that include details of somebody's work or workplace. Performance. We have very early choregic, so curse tablets that are written about people in the choruses. Actually, sporting events don't happen in our record until much later in the imperial period, interestingly. Erotic curse tablets that pull people apart, couples apart, that you want to separate. And a little bit later, interestingly, curse tablets that bewitch people to come together. And then there are border area spells, which is a classification of those spells that appear to include prayers for justice and revenge alongside these binding spell formulae. And one of the most popular interpretations of these curses is that they were written in situations of competition, and that they tended to be written by the person who felt that they were slightly at a disadvantage. So Christopher Farioni argues that it's the perennial underdog protecting himself against otherwise insurmountable odds. And this emphasis on a single cultural characteristic, it works well for some individual tablets and for some groups of curse tablets, in particular those associated with sporting events. But for numerous other curse tablets, this explanation is actually a little less compelling. And I think that it may in fact help to, it prevents the illumination of different kinds of circumstances that might actually fit a curse's creation. I'll give you 2 examples. Okay, so the first is the law courts, where you would expect the theory of competition to work out extremely well. And indeed, it may explain the relationships between writer and victims. And what's interesting actually is that these are groups of victims, because obviously these are groups of people going to court. But it doesn't in fact explain the appearance of some of the other characters that we find on these judicial curse tablets. So for example, the judges, the dicasti, why would you want to immobilize and restrain those? Even more puzzling, those who stand around are frequently referred to in these curse tablets. And even more puzzling, women. We find women in judicial curse tablets, right? And they're certainly not going to be active in the Athenian law courts. So why is it that they are cursed? We don't know. Let me give you another. These are commercial curses, and Christopher Varians argued that these are written in a context of business rivalry. This is one businessman cursing another businessman, and that's what this is about. But in fact, when you actually look at the curses themselves, it's difficult to maintain that argument, because often the business aspect is brought into the curse as part of the formula of the curse. So it's almost as if it's just one more way in which you can attack an individual and attack their lifestyle and make them suffer. But it isn't necessarily, from the ways in which they're written, it isn't clear, at least to me, that these are anything more than that these are business rivalry. And of course, we don't know who's writing them. So that makes it even more difficult. A particularly fine example of the difficulties of this comes in this tablet, which has been held up as an example of a commercial curse. But again, difficult to maintain that because the businesses are different. And we also have judicial language in here. So again, unless this is a very wide-ranging businessman who's writing this curse, it's difficult to see how you could countenance this being about commercial competition. So I think that these texts reveal a broader range of relationships than simply that. I think they're focused on potential risks. And by risk, I mean the term as used by social scientists like Mary Douglas, the anthropologist who used it to denote the hazards that are highlighted as important by a particular culture. So it may be that were we to measure the risk, it wouldn't matter at all. It was highly unlikely to happen. But cultures focus in on particular dangers and threats. And these are often related to the shared beliefs of a culture, the values that they have, the conceptions of the causes of misfortune, and the way in which they allocate blame and responsibility. And I think these binding spells suggest that one big risk amongst the ancient Greeks was other people. When we read these texts in terms of that kind of theory, and we set these readings in context using other evidence as well, they suggest that in different ways, in different circumstances, ancient Greek men and women might see their fellows as sources of danger and potential causes of misfortune. So the creation of a curse tablet means that a relationship has broken down. And of course, if someone is using magical spells against you, it doesn't matter whether you're the underdog or not, you're also going to use magical spells. And then you get what Daniel Ogden has called a magical arms race. And you get a situation in which a curse like this gets written. Somebody feels something's happened to him, he's suffered some kind of misfortune, he must have been cursed. What does he do? He writes a curse that goes out and hits anybody that might be wishing him misfortune. And so I will leave you now, coming back to Jenny, or rather the anonymous writer of this howl of pain. And I think, we can talk about it later, that the anonymous writer of this particular curse is taking part in an ages-old practice that dates back at least to the ancient Greeks. That's it.
Thank you very much, Esther.